President Donald Trump is anti-library. Or at least that's what a lot of publications seem to want you to believe. There was major panic this week after the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library was closed suddenly in Boston. But actually, this has more to do with the Trump administration's efforts to scale down the size of government. And to me, begs the question, what are the purpose of these institutions and do they need to be federally funded? Let's talk about what's going on and if the outrage is warranted. On Tuesday, February 18th, visitors at the JFK Presidential Library and Museum in Boston were escorted out. This is about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Signs were put up saying, due to an executive order, the library was closing, seemingly to imply indefinitely. The library is overseen by the National Archives, which is part of the federal government. The Trump administration has put an intense emphasis on downsizing federal waste, including slimming down the bureaucratic workforce to make sure money is being spent efficiently. And as an impacted agency, the library essentially said, we have a certain number of employees that are necessary for the day-to-day function of this operation. They greet attendees and visitors, and we can't function without them. And they were upset that there weren't exemptions given. Now, this reflects an ongoing battle between members of the federal workforce and the Trump administration, especially workers who feel as though they are extremely important to the function of their agency. There was a time period where federal agencies could apply for exemptions for their workers, but I guess not everyone did. And to me, again, the question is the federal money going to this presidential library necessary? Is it useful? And is there another way that you could structure it? I think this is something that is kind of being emotionally manipulated. And you see that in how quickly it resolved. By Wednesday, the National Archives was telling local media outlets that they were actually not going to close, that they would reopen on February 19th. But I think we should talk about the overall reaction to this, because emotions seem to be at the core of this, even when logic tells us there were other options. In particular, members of the Kennedy family had really strong reactions to the library's closure. They took to their social medias and other media outlets to talk about what happened and seemingly to imply, in my impression, that this was an actual insult to their grandfather's legacy rather than a comment or an attempt to slim down bloated federal government agencies. It seemed very personal. Obviously, it's a museum and library named after a relative. On the other hand, it also seemed to feel a little bit like a chance to just bash the Trump administration from longstanding Democrats. Jack Schlossberg, who used to be a political correspondent for Vogue, but who left social media temporarily after the election, took to his personal social medias to slam Elon Musk and to express his frustration with Doge.
White House shut down the JFK library. Hey, it's Jack. I'm okay. But our country is not. It's under attack from its own government. They are using propaganda to steal the past away from the American. In my opinion, has nothing to do with government efficiency. The workers who were fired today actually bring in revenue for the government. It's really about stealing the past and about generating propaganda so that people don't know what's really happening. Above me is a picture. It's given to me by an astronaut. It says, Jack, your family's legacy has enabled humans to take photos like these. That's true. JFK sent a man to the moon. But you'd never know it if the JFK library wasn't open and no one was allowed to talk about it. It's time to speak out and resist what's happening. If you're not doing that, you're not helping. The darkest places in hell are reserved for those who, in times of great moral crisis, maintain their neutrality. Dante's Inferno. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Stealing the past. That's a pretty strong allegation for what ultimately ended up being a less than 24-hour closure. And in fact, if it's true that the National Archives could have exempted all of the employees that were affected by this, it almost seems like his anger is misdirected. It's almost as if the federal agency in charge of overseeing his grandfather's or his great-grandfather's legacy was actually not that good at their job, and maybe they should have done something. I can understand, like I said, that it's emotional, but the allegation that no one would know about America's accomplishments in space if they weren't allowed to keep a presidential library open is a little bit crazy. I've been to a lot of presidential libraries. I think they're great. I think they can be interesting, but don't delete the past. I mean, especially in the internet day and age, people would still know about this. the desire to panic over this and to whip up cultural divide seems a little ridiculous to me. But again, I guess I'm sorry your feelings are hurt. I don't know. But Jack wasn't the only Kennedy that reacted this week to this news with sort of an intense emotional appeal to the public to fear the Trump administration. Former Congressman Joe Kennedy III was asked about the library's brief closure in an interview on CBS Boston.
John, from my understanding, leadership at the John F. Kennedy Library today received a communication from the leadership at the National Archives that oversees the library that was effectuating an order from the administration to terminate all, as they call it, probationary employees, which are folks that essentially have been hired there within the past year, without any consideration for who those folks were. And at the John F. Kennedy Library, it so happens that of the 5 employees affected, they were the ones that were responsible for greeting visitors, the visitor experience, actually education, outreach, some of the rental activities and such that are revenue generating. But it also meant that today, for all the visitors that were there, they had to dismiss people inside the library today and close effective immediately and until further notice, because that's the staff that is responsible for running the day-to-day operations of the library. And so the Trump administration has effectively shut down the John F. Kennedy Library.
Was the library targeted?
I think that the National Archives went through as was effectuating that order coming from the administration. And I would like to think that it was not a deliberate target at the Kennedy Library. But I think what we've seen is that there's not exactly a whole lot of thought given to what are the consequences of these actions. And so, the idea that somehow targeting libraries is going to be the right way to balance the budget or address efficiencies across government. Folks, when we start shutting down libraries in the name of government efficiency, we got a problem. And that's what we're looking at here.
I mean, how much money are we talking about?
I haven't seen the exact budget here, but John, 5 people that are new hires to the underneath the National Archives and Records Administration. It's going to be hard to balance the Trump tax cuts at $4.5 trillion off of their backs.
So Joe Kennedy's explanation gives more detail. He says 5 people were affected, and it actually makes me sort of less sympathetic. There were only 5 people the National Archives needed to exempt to keep this going. It almost seems like bad luck that the docents that you had, the greeters, hadn't been there for longer than a year. I understand that for some people, these layoffs are shocking and they seem to come out of nowhere. And of course, people losing their jobs, it's extremely stressful. On the other hand, it seems like the Kennedy Library was aware who was needed to keep it open. And even though there seemed to have been a path forward to get them exemptions, they didn't do it. Now, maybe the Trump administration didn't grant the exemptions. I'm not sure. But escalating this to the government is shutting down libraries in the name of efficiencies seems misleading. Most presidential libraries have an admissions fee. Yes, there are research archives and you can go to them, but it's not like your local library that's doing story time for the kindergarten class. There are institutions that archive all of the materials from a president's time in office. They're useful, but they aren't just like a local resource that anybody can easily access. Like I said, most have admissions fee from my understanding, or at least all the ones I've been to.
What does this mean to you personally?
I mean, look, John, this is a great institution for Massachusetts. It's a great institution. It's one of the institutions that actually attracts visitors from around the world. And they come here to experience and learn about President Kennedy, learn about what that period in our history stood for. And so the fact that those visitors aren't going to be able to get that experience is obviously deeply disappointing. The issue, though, isn't so much what it means for me or any members of my family that the library gets shut down. It's in the name of our government, we're starting to shut libraries that are tools to educate our public about our history and trying to use that history to learn for our future. That's a dangerous thing. And let's hope that this was a mistake. Let's hope it will get corrected. But at a certain point here, folks, you can't keep shooting first, asking questions later and say, oh, we'll fix it again. There are thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people around the world that are going hungry because of lack of programs and assistance that the United States has pushed out for decades across bipartisan basis. Interestingly enough, USAID was founded by President Kennedy. 8 programs that will help out millions of people. Medicaid, that is on the chopping block from this administration, that is responsible for the healthcare for millions and millions of Americans, all on the chopping block in the name of tax cuts for the wealthy. Right? And to say nothing of the corruption within the system, the idea that this thing is all being perpetrated by a guy, the richest guy on the planet, who is wealthy in large part because of government contracts, is just beyond the pale. And yet we're supposed to take his word for it. It's heartbreaking.
Some of the firings and cuts in this wave we've been experiencing have been reversed upon further review by the perps. Are there any efforts underway to reverse these cuts? Is there any chance they might be reversed? Do you have any sense of that?
Look, I mean, common sense would say we hope so. I don't think, like most favorable to the administration here, that they quite knew what they were doing when they effectuated this order and had an intent to shut down the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library. I would hope that's not the case. And I would hope in short order some of these folks are reinstated, and there's a way here to make sure that this institution can continue to provide the education and experience that it does for so many, again, not just in this area, but around the world. I hope that's the case. As I said, the fact is, though, that this is no way to run a railroad, right? Let alone a government. You can't keep firing people and then say, oops, we need people. We didn't mean to do that. John, you're aware they fired some people from an agency and then hired them back so that they could perpetuate more firings because they actually needed the people they fired in order to fire more people. It is not only gross incompetence, it is cruel, and it is not what I don't think the American public is asking for in a government that you want somebody to shake things up in the way that they work. That's one thing. You want to target the way in which our government operates to try to effectuate the desires of the American public. That's another. My predecessor and your friend mine, Barney Frank, once said, government is simply the name we give to the things we do together, right? They are the way in which we try to address problems that confront us all. And there's plenty of efficiencies to be found in the government. I grant you that. I served in it for years, and I would be the first one to say there's places to cut out that fat. That being said, doing this with the intent to be cruel, to dehumanize, to be gleeful at the pain that you are inflicting across millions of people. And make no mistake, people will die because of some of these cuts. People will lose access to healthcare across the United States to perpetuate tax cuts in the name of the wealthy at the expense of the poor. They have to own up to what they're doing, and they're not. That's going to be up to the American public to be able to tell that story and to tell that effectively. And that I hope will come over the weeks and months ahead. But make no mistake of what they're doing here. It is enrichment of a few at the expense of the many, and to try to distract with the chaos to make sure that we don't know what's going on.
Kennedy does go on to acknowledge that there is inefficiency in government, but he pretty much maintains that this is a blunder by the Trump administration. He says he doesn't think they intended to shut down the library, but almost like a bull in a china shop, the administration is just smashing up bureaucracies left and right, and they're not realizing that they are destroying some of the crucial infrastructure in the process. I don't think that's an entirely fair assessment, especially because it doesn't seem to acknowledge that the National Archives had some responsibility in all of us. If the National Archive didn't go for any sort of recourse to maintain these essential employees, why don't you hold them accountable? Or moreover, if your family thinks that it's so important, so crucial that this library never shut down under any circumstances, why aren't you privately funding it entirely? I think there are a lot of people who love JFK's legacy, who are interested in the things that he's done, who would donate to that cause. It's not totally clear to me why it has to be federally funded. So maybe that's why we should talk about the history of presidential libraries. The tradition of presidential libraries were created under Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1939. President Roosevelt felt like there was an important need to archive information and any sort of records from different presidencies in order to strengthen our understanding of history and to continue to move the nation forward. On its website, the National Archives features a quote from President Roosevelt on the day of his presidential library's dedication. It says, "To bring together the records of the past and to house them in buildings where they will be preserved for the use of men and women in the future, a nation must believe in three things. It must believe in the past. It must believe in the future. It must, above all, believe in the capacity of its own people so to learn from the past that they can gain in judgment in creating their own future." Before the creation of presidential libraries, presidents' records were kind of scattered and individually managed, although the National Archive notes that a lot of pre-Hoover documents are stored in the Library of Congress today. Ultimately, Congress passed the Presidential Library Act in 1955. This act creates the privately funded construction of a library that is then federally funded and maintained. And ultimately, the goal is to archive any documents from a president's term in office. This isn't always how things are done. Obama and the Obama Foundation famously opted to digitize his records and then have a privately funded library that they maintain on their own. This library has been delayed several times. I think right now it's scheduled to open in the spring of 2026. So in addition to the act passed in 1955, presidential libraries are also subject to the Presidential Record Act of 1978, which gives archivists the right to take custody of the records from an administration, and the Presidential Record Act of 1986, which basically oversees and mandates the use of privately funded endowments to maintain the libraries. Again, mixing that private and federal funding together. I want to be totally clear. I think libraries are great. I think they can be incredible resources. But I think comparing a presidential library to your local community library is a little bit manipulative. I think it's a little bit dishonest. I understand why the Kennedys feel an emotional tie to JFK's library, but it's not the same thing as the place that you take your third grader in the summer to check out books. They can be great resources for people studying presidential history, different acts, who want to see original documents. And I think that's great. But trying to paint this as the Trump administration is anti the little guys, they're anti-library, they're anti-education, is simply not accurate. And again, if you feel so strongly that these things need to be open always, why would you not privately fund them? Every couple years, we have a debate over the budget and the government closes for 12 hours or is on the brink of closing. If you think it's so important that it stays open, but our federal system is so fragile, I don't really understand why you're not stepping in and doing something. I suspect a lot of it is sort of anti-Trump energy, and I do understand where people feel as though these mass layoffs are scary and potentially not reviewed. But I admire the Trump administration's push forward. They promised to make the government more efficient, and that's what they're doing. If you haven't, I encourage you all to go visit a presidential library, especially for president you admire. They can be really interesting. I've been to George W. Bush's library. I've been to Bill Clinton's presidential library, and let me see, who was the last one? I've been to Harry Truman's presidential library. That's the last one. They're really interesting, but you have to like museums, right? You're not going there to check out the latest like Colin Hoover novel or whatever. Important tools, but let's not freak out and become unrealistic about what they're accomplishing. Like I said, this panic, which flared up on Tuesday, almost immediately went away. So I'm sure we'll get updates from the Trump administration on these layoffs and on the probationary employees who lost their jobs. Losing your job isn't fun. On the other hand, I don't know that constantly making these weird emotional manipulative appeals is the path forward for people who feel as though the Trump administration needs to be more particular in who they're letting go of. But that's just my thought on this. I'd love to hear what you guys think. Please let me know if you've been to a presidential library and which ones are the best ones. You'll notice that this is a break from my normal review of a week of a cabinet member. If you're liking those, let me know. I've enjoyed doing them. I think it's a good way to see sort of what the priorities for cabinet members are. I just had a little bit less time this week, so I thought I would take a break, talk about some libraries, and get y'all's feedback on the JFK library or whatever presidential library you've been to. Thanks again to everybody who's subscribed. I'm so appreciative for the support, and I really enjoy being able to hear from you and hear what you're interested in. So keep commenting and let me know how I can use this channel to help you guys navigate this crazy news cycle. If you miss me during the week, you can follow me on X, and I'm also still working with the quartering. Again, hoping this channel grows, but we'll start with one video a week for now. So check back next week for another video. Thanks so much.